She's sitting across from someone who's falling apart, a friend maybe, or someone she hasn't spoken to in years who called out of nowhere at midnight because they didn't know who else would pick up. The person is talking, fast, scattered, circling the same wound from different angles the way people do when they're trying to outrun something that's already caught them. And she's not saying much. She's not offering solutions or reframing the pain into something more manageable. She's just there, still in a way that doesn't feel empty but full, like the silence she's holding has weight to it, and that weight is somehow making the room feel safer than any words could. The person on the other end of this eventually pauses. Something in them loosens. They've talked to therapists about this. They've talked to family. They've gotten advice, perspective, strategies, reassurance. None of it touched whatever this is touching. And they can't explain why sitting with someone who's barely spoken feels like the first time in months they've been able to breathe. They just know that something shifted in the room. And it happened because of the quality of attention this person brought into it. A quality that most people don't carry, and fewer still understand. Jung spent years studying a figure he kept encountering in places most psychologists would never think to look. Gnostic manuscripts, alchemical texts, the dreams of patients who were deep in the middle of their own psychological transformation. The figure was Sophia, the Greek personification of divine wisdom, and she appeared across centuries, across cultures, in forms so varied and yet so consistent that Jung came to believe she represented something embedded in the human psyche itself. A pattern, a developmental threshold, a way of being that a very small number of people actually reached, and that couldn't be studied into existence or faked. Sophia wisdom, in Jung's understanding, was forged only one way, through genuine suffering that a person neither ran from nor was destroyed by. He noticed that the people who carried this quality had almost always been through something that looked, from the outside, like psychological destruction. Their empathy hadn't always been this steady, this precise, this quietly powerful. It had started raw, overwhelming, boundaryless, the kind of sensitivity that left them wrecked after every interaction and unable to distinguish their own emotions from everyone else's. But somewhere along the way, through a process Jung would have recognized as individuation, that raw sensitivity had been compressed, refined, transformed into something fundamentally different in character. Something closer to perception than absorption. Something that could hold the full weight of another person's darkness without collapsing under it. Today I'm going to walk you through 8 signs that you carry this specific capacity, what I'm calling the Sophia Empath, the person whose empathy has completed enough of the Jungian developmental arc to become something genuinely rare. Most of these signs will feel like things you've kept private, things you've noticed about yourself and quietly filed away because they didn't fit any framework you'd been given. Things you maybe tried to explain once and watched the other person's face go politely blank. Jung would have recognized every single one of them. And if you find yourself nodding at 5 or more, there's a real chance that what you've been calling too sensitive your entire life has been the wrong word for something you didn't have the language for until now. Before we get into the signs, there's a distinction that matters. Most people who are emotionally sensitive are carrying what Jung would have recognized as an unintegrated empathic wound. The sensitivity is real, deeply, genuinely real, but it hasn't been through the fire yet. It bleeds into everything. Their emotional states get hijacked by whoever's standing closest. They give until they're hollowed out and then can't understand why resentment has moved in where generosity used to live. This isn't a flaw in them. It's what happens when high sensitivity develops without the individuation process running alongside it. The raw material is there. The refinement hasn't happened. The Sophia Empath is what emerges on the other side of that refinement. Their empathy has been compressed under enough psychological pressure, enough shadow work, enough confrontation with their own depths, enough dark nights endured without shortcuts, that it's changed form entirely. They feel everything the unintegrated empath feels, but the feeling doesn't flood them anymore. It informs them. It moves through them the way light moves through glass instead of shattering it. Jung would have called this the functional expression of the Sophia archetype, wisdom that lives in the body and the gut, and somewhere older than either, earned through the kind of honest encounter with darkness that most people spend their lives avoiding. Like carbon that's been under enough pressure for long enough that its molecular structure has reorganized into something entirely different, something that doesn't break under weight anymore, because the weight is what made it. The first sign of the Sophia empath is one most people around them never notice, because the Sophia empath never announces it. You feel the gap between what people say and what they actually mean, and you feel it constantly, involuntarily, with a clarity that sometimes makes you wish you could turn it off. Someone is telling a story at dinner, a good story. Everything's going well, career's on track, the new relationship is great, life is moving in the right direction. Everyone at the table is nodding along, asking follow-up questions, taking the narrative at face value. And you're nodding too. You're smiling in the right places. But something underneath the words has already registered in you, a frequency below the performance. Something hollow in the laugh that came a half-second too late. An energy behind the eyes that doesn't match the story being told. A tightness in the way they said "great" that told you more than the entire rest of the sentence. You don't say anything about it. Maybe you never will. Maybe later that night you'll think about it and wonder if you imagined it, if you're projecting, if you're being unfair to someone who was just trying to have a nice dinner. But 3 weeks later, the phone rings, and it's that person, and the story has fallen apart, and the career is in crisis, and the relationship ended, and they're calling you, specifically you, because something in them sensed that you already knew, that you'd been holding space for the truth they weren't ready to tell, even while they were performing the version that felt safer. Jung observed that the unconscious communicates constantly through what he called feeling-toned complexes, emotional charges attached to specific themes or memories that surface involuntarily, leaking through the edges of a person's controlled presentation. Most people don't pick up on these signals because their own conscious mind is too busy managing its own performance to register anyone else's unconscious output. But people with a highly developed empathic function, particularly those who've done enough inner work to quiet their own psychological noise, can perceive these transmissions with startling accuracy. Jung didn't frame this as supernatural. He believed it was a genuine perceptual capacity, rooted in the psyche's ability to process enormous amounts of non-verbal information at speeds conscious thought can't track. Rare, poorly understood, easily dismissed, but real. The gift and the burden of this are the same thing. The capacity that lets you perceive truth beneath performance means you can never fully relax into pretense. Social situations that require collective agreement that everything's fine. Family gatherings where the dysfunction sits in the center of the table like a dish no one acknowledges. Work meetings where everyone performs enthusiasm for a decision that makes no sense. Friendships where you can feel the resentment pulsing underneath 12 years of politeness. These register in your body as a kind of low-grade nausea. You can participate. You've learned how. But there's always a part of you standing slightly outside the agreed-upon version of reality, watching the distance between what's being said and what's actually happening, holding both without being able to fully commit to either. Jung would have called this the earliest expression of the Sophia capacity, wisdom arriving through perception rather than analysis. It's uncomfortable, it's often unwanted, and it's the foundation that every other sign on this list is built on, the bedrock ability to register what's real, even when everyone around you has agreed to register something else. The second sign is the one that separates the Sophia empath from everyone who is simply emotionally sensitive. You've survived your own darkness, and you didn't come out harder for it. A lot of empathic people absorb others' pain. They move towards suffering like it's magnetic, and they take it in, and they carry it. The Sophia empath does this too, but there's something else in their history, something that distinguishes them in a way that can't be performed or shortcut. At some point, they had to stop descending into other people's depths and descend into their own, and that descent is the dividing line. Jung was unequivocal about this. Sophia wisdom cannot be borrowed. It cannot be inherited. It cannot be acquired through reading or practice or proximity to wise people. It forms only through genuine encounter with your own shadow, the full, honest, often devastating confrontation with the parts of yourself you've spent your life pretending don't exist. What this descent looks like varies from person to person. Sometimes it's a depression that lasted years, the kind that sat so deep no one around you fully grasped what was happening because you kept functioning on the surface while something essential was being dismantled underneath. Sometimes it's the collapse of a relationship that had become the entire architecture of your identity, and when it fell, you discovered you had no idea who you were without it. Sometimes it's a period of disorientation so complete that the word lost doesn't begin to capture it. You weren't lost the way someone loses their direction. You were lost the way someone loses their name. But whatever form it took, there's a through line. You went into something dark. You stayed in it long enough for it to do its work, and you came out the other side carrying something you didn't have before, something that can't be named easily, but that changes the way you move through rooms and hold conversations and sit with people who are suffering. Jung studied alchemy for decades, and the reason had nothing to do with chemistry. He believed the alchemist had stumbled onto psychological truths centuries before psychology existed as a discipline. One of those truths was the process they called nigredo, the blackening phase, where the base material had to decompose completely before transformation could begin. The old form had to be destroyed, the structure had to dissolve, and everything about that dissolution looked, from every available angle, like pure loss. Jung recognized the same process operating in the human psyche. There are periods when everything that constituted your sense of self, your roles, your beliefs, your understanding of what your life means, breaks down. And the person going through it almost always interprets the breakdown as failure, as punishment, as proof that something has gone irreparably wrong. Here's what makes the Sophia empath distinct from most people who go through dark periods. Most people who encounter genuine suffering either harden as a defense or collapse under the weight. The hardening looks like toughness, emotional walls, cynicism, a learned distance from vulnerability that gets mistaken for strength. The collapse looks like chronic woundedness, an identity built around damage, a life organized around avoiding further pain. Both of these are understandable, both are human, and neither produces what the Sophia empath carries. The Sophia empath came out softer, more permeable, not less, more willing to feel, not more defended against feeling. And this confuses the people around them because the cultural script says suffering is supposed to produce either armor or fragility. The Sophia empath produces neither. They produce something that looks, from the outside, almost like a strange kind of peace. The peace of someone who has been to the bottom and discovered that the bottom didn't kill them, and that what they found down there was, somehow, the thing they'd been missing all along, their own depth, their own darkness, integrated rather than denied. The full spectrum of who they actually are, held without flinching. Gold doesn't emerge because conditions were comfortable. It forms under exactly the kind of pressure most materials can't survive. And the thing that makes it valuable isn't that it avoided the compression, it's that it became itself because of it. The third sign is the one that most ordinary empaths are still working toward, and many never reach. Your empathy has edges now. You can feel deeply without being consumed by what you feel. If you've been highly sensitive for any significant stretch of your life, you know what empathy without edges feels like. It feels like walking into a room and immediately absorbing the emotional weather of every person in it. It feels like sitting with a friend who's grieving and leaving the conversation carrying their grief in your chest for the next 3 days. It feels like an inability to distinguish between your emotional state and someone else's, like the membrane between you and the world is so thin that everything bleeds through. This kind of empathy is real, and it's exhausting, and it's the version most sensitive people know intimately. Jung would have recognized it as the unintegrated empathic function. The capacity is genuine, the container for it hasn't been built yet. What changes in the Sophia empath is the container. Through the individuation process, through the shadow work and the long confrontation with their own depths, they develop what Jung would have called psychological differentiation. The ability to be fully present with another person's pain while remaining themselves. To feel the weight of what someone else is carrying without that weight transferring permanently into their own body. To go into the dark room with someone and sit there, genuinely and completely, and then leave the room and still know who they are. The membrane is still thin, they still feel everything, but the feeling moves through them now instead of getting trapped inside. And here's where honesty matters, because there's a version of this that looks the same from the outside, but comes from a completely different place. Some people who appear to have edges around their empathy haven't developed edges at all. They've shut down. The feeling got too expensive, and somewhere along the way, their system decided to stop paying. They call it boundaries, they call it growth. But if they're honest, and this might sting, what actually happened is that the felt response went quiet. The capacity to genuinely enter someone else's experience has been replaced by a kind of managed distance that performs empathy without actually experiencing it. The distinction Jung would draw is precise. Can you choose to go in? When someone you care about is genuinely suffering, is there a real, felt, embodied response in you? One you can also step back from when the moment requires it? Or has the response itself gone silent? The Sophia empath has edges and depth. The depth is still fully alive. They can feel the full catastrophic weight of another person's worst moment. They just don't drown in it anymore. They can hold it the way you hold something heavy, aware of the weight, affected by it, and still standing. And people who spend time in the presence of this kind of empathy experience something they often can't quite articulate. They feel held without being managed, seen without being analyzed, accompanied in their darkness without the implicit pressure to hurry up and get better so the empath can stop hurting. Jung would have called this the beginning of the genuine healing function, the capacity that allows the Sophia empath to be useful in the specific way that nothing else in a suffering person's life can replicate. Advice helps with decisions. Therapy helps with patterns. Medication helps with chemistry. But being in the presence of someone who can genuinely feel what you're feeling without being destroyed by it, that helps with something more fundamental. It helps with the loneliness of pain itself, the sense that what you're going through has placed you outside the reach of everyone who claims to care. The Sophia empath reaches through that isolation because their empathy has been refined enough to survive the crossing. And if you've been carrying this capacity, this ability to feel deeply and clearly at the same time, this strange combination of permeability and steadiness that you've never had a name for, then what's coming in the next several signs may start to explain things about yourself that you've been quietly wondering about for longer than you'd admit. The fourth sign is where the Sophia empath's function becomes genuinely distinct, and where most people around them misread them completely. You're drawn to people in their darkest moments, and when you get there, you don't try to fix them. This one requires some specificity because on the surface it sounds like basic compassion. Plenty of people care about others who are struggling. Plenty of people show up during hard times. But the Sophia empath doesn't just show up, they show up differently. And the difference is something you can feel in a room before anyone says a word about it. Think about the last time someone in your life hit a genuine crisis, a real one. The kind that doesn't resolve with a good conversation and a glass of wine. The kind where the person calling you can barely get the sentences out, where there's something in their voice that has moved past regular sadness into something rawer and less organized, something that doesn't have a shape yet. Most people who get those calls and who genuinely care, who genuinely want to help, respond with some version of movement. They move toward fixing, toward reframing, toward finding the bright side, offering the plan, naming the next step. And they do this out of love, almost always. But they also do it because sitting in genuine darkness with another person, without doing anything about it, is one of the most psychologically demanding things a human being can attempt. The urge to fix is partly compassion, and partly the fixer's own nervous system screaming for relief. The Sophia empath stays. They don't rush toward light because they've already learned, through their own descent, through their own long seasons of darkness, that the rush toward light can interrupt the very thing that darkness is trying to do. They've lived the experience of having someone sit with them in their worst moment without panic, and they know what that did for them. And they know, on a level deeper than strategy, that their presence in the dark room is more useful than any advice they could offer from outside it. Jung understood this through what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to generate something genuinely new when enough tension is held between opposites without being collapsed prematurely. When someone is in crisis, there's a tension between where they are and where they need to be. When a well-meaning friend rushes in with solutions, they're collapsing that tension. They're short-circuiting the process. The Sophia empath, without necessarily knowing Jung's terminology, is doing something far more sophisticated. They're holding the space in which the transcendent function can actually do its work. They're trusting the other person's psyche to find its own way through, and their steady presence is what makes that finding possible. From the outside, this can look like passivity. People watching the Sophia empath sit with someone in crisis sometimes get frustrated. Why aren't they doing anything? Why aren't they offering guidance? The person is clearly drowning, and the Sophia empath is just sitting there, being quiet, being present, apparently doing nothing at all. But the person who's actually drowning usually tells a different story. They describe the experience as feeling held in a way they've rarely felt before, like someone finally granted them permission to be exactly where they were, in the full mess of it, without the implicit pressure to perform recovery on someone else's timeline. There's a cost to this that the Sophia empath knows intimately. When you're the person who can sit in darkness without panicking, dark situations find you. People sense it. They may not understand what they're sensing, but they gravitate toward it. The friend who calls at midnight. The coworker who starts crying in the break room and turns to you instead of anyone else. The stranger at the gathering who somehow ends up next to you, spilling things they haven't told their own therapist. These encounters aren't random. Something in the Sophia empath's energy broadcasts a signal that reads, to people in distress, as safety, as survivability, as this person will not be destroyed by what I'm about to say. That signal is real, and it's earned. It came from the Sophia empath's own passage through difficulty, but it costs energy, significant energy. The Sophia empath needs solitude in ways that people around them don't always understand, because they're metabolizing emotional material that most people never have to process. Their need for quiet, for time alone, for stretches of zero social contact. This isn't introversion in the personality type sense. It's restoration. Something in them needs to be replenished after the kind of psychic weight they carry routinely, and the replenishment only happens in silence. Jung would have been clear-eyed about this trade-off. The capacity and the cost are inseparable. The same permeability that makes the Sophia empath so effective in dark moments also makes them vulnerable to depletion if they don't protect their reserves. And the ones who last, the ones who can do this across a lifetime without burning out entirely, are the ones who've learned that their solitude isn't selfish, it's structural. It's the condition that makes everything else they offer possible. The fifth sign is the one the Sophia empath is most likely to discount about themselves, because it doesn't arrive with a logical explanation attached to it. You carry a knowing that shows up before the reasoning does, sometimes well before, sometimes so far before that by the time events confirm what you already sensed, you've almost forgotten you sensed it. Here's what the experience actually feels like from the inside. A decision needs to be made, by you, by someone close to you, by a group you're part of. Everyone discusses it. The analysis points clearly in one direction. The arguments are sound. The evidence supports a particular conclusion. And something in you, quiet but absolutely certain, points the other direction. You can't defend it. You can't construct a rational case for it. If someone pressed you, and people do press because your alternative makes no logical sense to them, the most honest thing you could say is, I just know. And you understand while you're saying it how that sounds. You know it sounds like arrogance or stubbornness or some irrational attachment to being different. So most of the time, you soften it. You say, I have a feeling, or something doesn't sit right, or I'm not sure, let me think about it. All of which are dilutions of what's actually happening, which is that you perceived the answer before the question was finished being asked. Jung placed intuition among the 4 primary psychological functions, alongside thinking, feeling, and sensation, and he was careful to locate it outside the realm of mysticism. He understood intuition as the psyche's capacity to process unconscious information and surface the result as direct knowing. The unconscious mind takes in enormous quantities of data that the conscious mind never registers. Micro-expressions, tonal shifts, pattern fragments, environmental signals that are too subtle for deliberate attention, but that the deeper layers of the psyche absorb constantly. Intuition is what happens when that absorbed data gets processed below awareness, and the conclusion arrives in consciousness fully formed, without the intermediate steps visible. What makes the Sophia empath's intuition sharper than most is something Jung would have traced directly back to the individuation work, because they've spent real time in dialogue with their unconscious, through shadow work, through genuine encounters with their own depths, through the long process of learning to listen to parts of themselves they spent years ignoring. The channel between their unconscious perception and their conscious awareness is more open than it is in most people. There's less noise in the way, less defensive filtering, less of the ego's constant narration drowning out the signal from below. What other people would need to reason through carefully, the Sophia empath often receives as a kind of direct download, unmediated, unexplained, and uncomfortably accurate. The social difficulty of this is real and ongoing. In a culture that demands evidence for every conclusion, the Sophia empath's way of knowing gets dismissed constantly. They learn, over time, to keep most of it to themselves, to hold the knowing privately and wait for events to confirm or deny it. And events confirm it often enough that even the Sophia empath eventually stops being surprised by the accuracy and starts being frustrated by the inability to communicate it. There's a particular loneliness in seeing something clearly and being unable to share it in a way that anyone will take seriously, like standing in a room full of people you care about and watching them walk towards something you can already see the shape of, knowing that saying, "Don't go that way," without a reason they can accept will only make you seem strange. The gold was always there, deep in the ore, before anyone thought to look for it. The knowing has always been there too, running underneath the surface of conscious thought. The Sophia empath didn't develop this capacity so much as they cleared enough away to finally access what was already operating. If any of this has been landing somewhere specific, if you've been listening with that quiet kind of recognition, the kind that lives in the chest more than the head, there's something worth mentioning here. We put together a set of 24 reflection exercises called True Self-Discovery, rooted in the same Jungian framework we've been exploring, built for people who sense they carry something like this, but have never had a structured way to work with it. It's designed to help you go deeper into exactly the kind of self-understanding we're talking about. The kind that doesn't come from reading more, but from sitting with what you already know and giving it room to clarify. The link is right below this video if that feels like something you're ready for. Because what comes next in these signs gets complicated in ways most people don't expect. The sixth sign is the one that costs the most, and the one most Sophia empaths carry the longest before they understand what it actually means. The people who love you most have also found you the hardest to know. This is the paradox that sits at the center of the Sophia empath's relational life, and it's a painful one. Someone who can read other people's emotional states with the kind of accuracy described in the earlier signs, someone who gravitates toward people in their worst moments and can hold them there, who perceives what's happening beneath the surface with an almost uncomfortable clarity. You'd expect this person to be the most accessible, the most reachable, the most knowable person in any room. And from the outside, they often appear to be. They're warm, they're present, they give the impression of openness. But the people closest to them, the partners, the oldest friends, the family members who've spent years trying to get all the way in, describe something else, something harder to pin down. They'll say the Sophia empath is somehow elusive, present and unreachable at the same time. Like there's always one more door behind the one that just opened, and behind that door is another one, and at some point you stop knocking because you've started to wonder whether reaching the center is actually possible. There's a painful asymmetry at work here, and Jung would have spotted it immediately. The Sophia empath has spent a lifetime being attuned to others, feeling into others, holding space for others. That attunement has become second nature, as automatic as breathing, but allowing themselves to be felt into, held, seen at the same depth they see others. That's foreign territory. It requires a kind of vulnerability that the Sophia empath's entire psychological structure wasn't built for. They were built to perceive, to hold, to witness. The machinery runs in one direction, and reversing it feels as unnatural as trying to write with the wrong hand while someone watches. Part of this is genuinely protective, and Jung would have honored that. The Sophia empath has earned, through long experience, a real discernment about who can handle their depth and who can't. They've made the mistake of opening too far with the wrong person and felt the particular sting of being met with blankness or incomprehension, or that polite smile people offer when they don't know what to do with what they've just been shown. That sting teaches something, and what it teaches looks like selectivity. It looks like high standards, and in part, it is. But here's where Jung would push, and where honesty requires more than the comfortable version. Some of that selectivity is actually fear wearing the costume of wisdom. Some of the elusiveness that the Sophia empath carries so gracefully is a defense mechanism that has gotten sophisticated enough to pass for discernment. The question Jung would ask is precise. When you hold back from being fully known, are you making a genuine assessment of the other person's capacity? Or are you protecting yourself from the terror of being seen as ordinary? From the possibility that if someone actually reached the center, what they'd find there wouldn't live up to the depth they were expecting. That question sits at the shadow side of this sign, and it's the uncomfortable mirror most Sophia empaths would rather not look into. Because the truth is, the capacity they offer others, that deep, steady, non-anxious presence, is also something they desperately need to receive. And the barrier to receiving it is often their own conviction that they should be the one holding, never the one held. That their role in every relational ecosystem is the strong one, the steady one, the container. And that stepping out of the container to be contained by someone else would somehow diminish them, or burden the other person, or violate some unspoken rule about who they're supposed to be. The most individuated Sophia empaths, the ones furthest along in the process Jung mapped, are the ones who've started cracking this pattern open. They've found one person, maybe two, with whom the machinery runs in both directions, with whom they can be seen the way they see others. These relationships are rare for them, and they tend to prize them above almost everything else in their lives, because those relationships are the only places where the full circuit completes, where the empath isn't just giving depth, but receiving it, where they can set the weight down. But the ones who haven't gotten there yet, and plenty of Sophia empaths haven't, carry a particular kind of solitude that's hard to describe to anyone who doesn't live inside it. They're surrounded by people who care about them. They have friends, family, communities. From the outside, their social world looks rich, but at the depth that matters most to them, at the frequency where they actually live, there's often no one there. They hold others in the dark and then sit in their own dark alone. And they've done it so long that they sometimes forget it could be any other way. Jung would have called the resolution of this pattern one of the later tasks of individuation, learning to receive with the same openness you offer. Learning that the vulnerability you've helped others through isn't something you're exempt from, that the circle of deep empathic connection only completes when it runs in both directions, and that allowing it to run inward requires a courage that's different from, and sometimes greater than, the courage of sitting with someone else's darkness. Because someone else's darkness is familiar by now. Your own need to be held is the thing that still scares you. And if that last sentence landed somewhere quiet in you, somewhere you don't usually let people look, then you already know this sign is yours. The question is whether you're going to keep carrying it alone, or whether somewhere in you there's enough trust left to let the circle complete with someone who's actually capable of meeting you there. This is where something in the Sophia empath begins to turn. Because that solitude, the one carved out by being deeply perceptive and rarely perceived in return, eventually teaches them something they couldn't have learned any other way. It teaches them what help actually looks like. And the answer surprises them, because it looks almost nothing like what they spent years offering. The seventh sign only appears after the Sophia empath has been through enough to understand the difference between helping someone and preventing them from learning. And it usually arrives quietly, without fanfare, after one too many experiences of pouring themselves into someone else's crisis and watching the crisis recycle anyway. after one too many nights spent holding someone together who didn't actually want to hold themselves, after the slow, grinding realization that the thing they called generosity had a thread of something else woven through it, something harder to look at. Because here's what Jung would have seen immediately if he'd sat across from a Sophia empath in their earlier years. The compulsive helping, the constant availability, the identity built around being the one who could absorb anyone's pain and still function. That pattern didn't come from nowhere. It came from a childhood where their value was measured in usefulness, where love arrived when they were performing a function and evaporated when they stopped, where the message, never spoken directly but understood perfectly, was that they existed for what they could provide, and the moment they stopped providing it, they became invisible. This is the wound underneath the gift. Jung would have recognized it in seconds. The empathy was real. The perception was genuine. But the delivery system, the rescuing, the fixing, the relentless showing up for everyone at any cost, was powered by something older and less noble than compassion. It was powered by the belief that they had to earn the right to exist through service, that rest was abandonment, that having needs of their own was selfish, that the only safe position in any relationship was the one who gives. The shift happens when they can't sustain that position anymore. The body gives out first, usually, or a relationship collapses so completely that no amount of rescuing could have prevented it. Or they rescue someone successfully. They give everything, the person gets better, the crisis passes, and then they feel nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, just a dull emptiness where the gratification used to be. And in that emptiness, a question surfaces that changes everything. Who am I when I'm not saving someone? Jung wrote about what he called the reflecting function, the psyche's capacity to develop through encountering itself in the presence of another person. He believed that genuine transformation didn't come from advice, from solutions, from someone swooping in with answers. It came from being truly witnessed. When another person can sit with you without needing you to be different, without rushing you toward resolution, without performing the role of helper, something in the psyche relaxes enough to see itself. And that seeing, Jung observed over and over, was the only thing that consistently produced real change. The Sophia empath who has reached this sign has internalized this at a level that goes beyond intellectual understanding. They've lived it. They've been the person who offered everything: time, energy, emotional bandwidth, practical help, midnight phone calls, explanations, patience beyond what anyone should have to sustain, and watched it change nothing. And they've also been the person who simply sat with someone in silence, offered no solution, fixed no problem, and watched something shift in the other person that all their rescuing never accomplished. What this looks like in practice is subtle enough that most people miss it entirely. The Sophia empath asks questions more than they give answers. They resist the pull to offer solutions, even when they can see the solution clearly, because they've learned that they're seeing the solution and the other person being ready to see it are two completely different things. They hold back the impulse to reassure when they sense that the discomfort someone is sitting in is doing necessary work. They trust the process in other people the way they had to learn to trust it in themselves, through all those years of their own darkness. People who spend time with a Sophia empath in this mode often describe something they can't quite articulate. They feel more capable afterward, more solid, like something the Sophia empath believes about them, about their ability to handle their own life, has somehow transmitted itself without ever being spoken. The mirror reflects back not what the person fears they are, but what they actually are. And seeing that, even for a moment, changes the architecture of what feels possible. But the cost is real, and Jung would have been honest about it. People who were accustomed to being rescued by the Sophia empath sometimes experience this shift as a withdrawal of love. They don't understand why the person who used to drop everything for them now asks a question instead of offering a solution. Why the person who used to absorb their crisis now sits with it rather than resolving it. The difference between witnessing and fixing looks, from certain angles, like indifference, and some relationships don't survive the recalibration. The people who needed the rescuer can't recognize the mirror as a deeper form of the same love. They just feel abandoned by someone who stopped performing the only role they valued. The Sophia empath carries this loss alongside the transformation. They know they're offering something more real than what they used to offer. They also know that what's real isn't always what's wanted, and that knowledge sits in them with a weight that doesn't fully lift. It just becomes something they can hold without being crushed by it. The eighth sign is the most difficult to describe, because it points towards something in Jungian psychology that most people's conscious minds genuinely aren't equipped to receive without resistance. It's the sign the Sophia empath is least likely to talk about openly, because every available word for the experience sounds either grandiose or delusional, and the Sophia empath is neither. The experience goes something like this. In certain moments, moments of deep connection, moments of silence in natural settings, moments of proximity to genuine suffering or uncomplicated joy, the Sophia empath feels something that can only be described as ancientness, a sense that what they're experiencing has been experienced before, that what they're carrying is larger than their personal history, that they are, in some way they can't rationally justify, a conduit for something much older than themselves. The feeling arrives without drama. It's quiet, specific, unmistakable, and then it recedes, leaving behind a residue of certainty that their rational mind doesn't know what to do with. This is where Jung's most radical idea becomes unavoidable. He proposed that beneath the personal unconscious, the layer where your individual memories, your childhood experiences, your repressions and complexes all live, there exists a deeper stratum he called the collective unconscious. A layer of psychic experience that doesn't belong to any individual, it belongs to the species. It accumulated across the entire span of human existence, and it contains what Jung called archetypes, primordial patterns of experience that repeat across cultures, across centuries, across every civilization that has ever produced mythology, art, or religion. Jung didn't propose this lightly. He was a psychiatrist, not a mystic, and he knew how this idea would land in the rationalist culture he inhabited. But he kept encountering it in his patients, people who dreamed symbols they'd never been exposed to, who produced imagery in their therapeutic work that precisely mirrored mythological motifs from traditions they knew nothing about, who described inner experiences that matched alchemical texts written centuries before their birth. The collective unconscious wasn't a theory Jung invented to sound profound. It was a pattern he couldn't ignore, no matter how much professional pressure existed to dismiss it. When someone has done enough individuation work, when they've gone deep enough into their own psyche that the boundary between personal and collective starts to thin, they begin to have experiences that don't fit inside a personal frame. The Sophia empath, by virtue of the depth and completeness of their inner journey, tends to reach this threshold, and when they do, the feeling of ancientness arrives. Because they are, in a very real psychological sense, touching something ancient. They're making contact with the accumulated wisdom of the species, filtered through the specific archetype that Jung spent years tracing through Gnostic cosmology, alchemical manuscripts, and the dreams of his most psychologically developed patients. The Sophia archetype is one of the oldest patterns in the collective unconscious. She appears in Greek philosophy as the personification of wisdom. She surfaces in Gnostic Christianity as a divine figure who descends into matter, suffers, and transforms. She emerges in medieval mysticism, in Eastern traditions, in folklore across continents that had no contact with each other. Jung believed this recurrence wasn't cultural borrowing or coincidence. It was the human psyche's repeated attempt to give form to a genuine inner experience, the experience of wisdom that can only be earned through suffering, understanding that can only arrive through the body and the heart rather than through the intellect alone. When the Sophia empath feels ancient, they're not being dramatic or self-important. They're registering a real encounter with something that exists at a depth most people never access. And the experience tends to come with very specific qualities. A sense of rootedness that has nothing to do with geography. A feeling of being connected to a lineage that extends far beyond family. a strange and persistent sense that what they're doing in their own small life is somehow connected to something much larger. This sign manifests practically in ways that are easy to overlook if you don't know what you're watching. The Sophia empath often has an unusual relationship with time. They're less frantic about productivity, less anxious about wasted years, less driven by the cultural urgency that keeps most people running. Something in them operates on a longer timeline than a single human lifespan, and while they can't explain this rationally, it shapes their decisions, their patience, their capacity to sit with slow processes that would make anyone else restless. They also tend to be drawn toward silence, toward natural spaces, toward experiences that strip away the noise of modern life and expose something more essential underneath. These aren't aesthetic preferences. They're the conditions under which the deeper layers of the psyche can make themselves felt. In silence, in stillness, in the absence of constant stimulation, the collective unconscious speaks more clearly. And the Sophia empath, whether they'd use this language or not, is someone who has learned to listen. Gold doesn't corrode. It doesn't diminish with time. It persists through conditions that destroy lesser materials, and what makes it precious is precisely its capacity to endure without losing its essential nature. The Sophia empath carries something with that quality, something that has been compressed and heated and pressured through every dark passage they've survived, and has emerged more concentrated, more luminous, more itself than it was before any of the difficulty began. 8 signs. And what they describe, taken together, isn't a personality type you can identify through a quiz or a checklist. It's a map of a psychological arc that Jung spent his career tracing. The arc of empathy refined through genuine encounter with darkness, transformed through shadow work and individuation, matured from a wound that absorbs everything into a form of perception that illuminates without consuming. Jung would never have described the Sophia empath as born that way. He'd have described them as forged, through the descent into their own shadow, through the long season of not knowing who they were, through the painful discovery that their rescuing impulse was braided with a childhood wound, through the even more painful decision to stop rescuing and start witnessing, through the slow, often lonely process of allowing their empathy to develop edges without losing depth, to become a tool of perception rather than a mechanism of self-erasure. If 5 or more of these signs landed for you, if the recognition you're feeling right now isn't the kind that makes you think, that's interesting, but the kind that sits heavier, the kind that names something you've carried privately and never expected to hear described out loud, then what you're recognizing is a developmental milestone, a place you've reached through effort and endurance, and a willingness to stay in the fire when every reasonable impulse told you to run. But Jung would have been direct about something here, and I want to honor that directness. The Sophia empath is not a superior type. Jung was deeply suspicious of any framework that the ego could hijack to claim elevated status. Every sign described in this video is a consequence, not an achievement. They're what emerges after enough difficulty has been allowed to do its full work on a psyche that didn't harden against it. The person who recognizes themselves here shouldn't feel proud. If anything, the recognition arrives with a deepened sense of responsibility for how they use this perception, for whether they let it serve only themselves or extend it outward, for whether they continue the work or settle into a comfortable identity built on having come this far. Because the Sophia archetype in Jung's framework is a direction you move toward throughout a lifetime. It has no finish line. Each layer of shadow honestly faced, each rescue impulse examined rather than indulged, each moment of staying present with darkness instead of rushing toward light, each time you allow yourself to be seen rather than only seeing, all of that is movement along the arc. The capacity doesn't plateau. The perception continues to sharpen, and the gold, under continued pressure, keeps becoming more pure. That's the nature of the process. You don't arrive, you keep refining. What you are, if you've recognized yourself here, is someone who has been through enough that the recognition itself carries weight. Someone whose sensitivity stopped being a liability somewhere along the way and became a form of sight. Someone who has earned, through real psychological work and real suffering, a kind of quiet authority over their own inner life that most people never develop. Jung spent decades watching for people like this. He knew how rare the full arc was. He also knew that the people who completed it rarely understood what they'd become, because the process that made them this way also stripped them of the need to announce it. So if you're sitting with this recognition right now, if something in this video has named a part of yourself you've been carrying silently, perhaps for years, you might want a way to keep working with what just surfaced. Our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's approach, designed for people who are already deep in this process and want to stay honest with themselves as they go further. The link is right below this video.